Buenas tardes, good afternoon. I'm going to be looking at the camera too, so it's not, I don't acknowledge the audience here present this afternoon. My name is Javier Duran. I'm the director of the Kaufman Center for Creative Inquiry, and it's a pleasure for us today to have this joint presentation and working with the Binational Migration Institute and the Fronteridades Project. As many of you know, the Fronteridades Project is an attempt to reclaim border narratives and relocate the places of those narratives back to the communities, the places of enunciation about border narratives. This is a complex project that involves a number of collaborators, and the Binational Migration Institute is one of them. So we're really pleased to be here. And first, I would like to invite my colleague, Yadira Caballero, to do the land acknowledgement. Yadira is the program manager at the Kaufman Center, and she has an MJ in Jurisprudence in Indian Law from the University of Tulsa, and also runs basically the Kaufman Center. Yadira, please. That's the truth.
Everybody, it's honored so. She Yadira Caballero Yanishia, look at the net initially. Nakai Bashishin, Nash Ejetoba, A Dashache Ado, Nakai Dashnele, Bidas eat there, Nasha Ado, Que, A Tucson, Dan, Queshed, Akut Ego, the net stun initially. Bilagana, Bizade, Ako Yashkit. So this is where I transition. Ako Yat means hello in my Diné language. I say this and I start with by introducing myself in my Diné language. It connects who I am as a Diné person, but also it connects myself to where I come from, especially where I come from, we establish ourselves with kinship, and we're all interconnected, especially to Mother Earth. So this is where I say that, right now, all of us where we're at, we currently reside on the Tohono O'odham Nation and the lands of the Pasquayaki tribes. They've been the ones whose care and keeping of these lands allows us to be here. They always continue to carry that rich culture, history, and stories. So wherever you go, wherever you travel, especially where we're at now, is to always carry that reflection of the original peoples that have always been here. So, Ahiahat, thank you.
Gracias, Yadira. Thank you so much. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the person who's going to introduce our main speaker. But I have to do this because Professor Dan Martinez, who is a distinguished scholar and associate professor of the School of Sociology, and he also serves as co-director by National Migration Institute in the Department of Mexican American Studies. It's one of the principal animators, I would say, in terms of the migration conversations on campus, not only through his work from the sociological perspective, but also in his exploration of issues related to Latinx studies, identities, and also trying to better understand, not only through data, but through stories, the just place of migrants in the conversation in the borderlands. So Dan is been very generous in terms of his collaboration with the Fronteridades project, and also with his own time, not only helping us in terms of ideas, but also helping us to select projects and other things. So Dan, thank you so much for the opportunity to collaborate, and now I'm going to let you introduce our speaker. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Javier. So, as Javier mentioned, my name is Dan Martinez. I'm an associate professor in the School of Sociology, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Binational Migration Institute here at the University of Arizona. I serve in that capacity along with my colleague, Dr. Ana O'Leary, as well as our founding director, Professor Raquel Goldsmith. So on behalf of BMI, I'd like to thank the Kaufman Center for Creative Inquiry for helping us with this event, for sponsoring this event. If it was not for them, we wouldn't be able to do this. So thank you to Yasmin, Yadira, Iram, and to Javier and Angela. Again, we would not be able to have done this without you. So our speaker today is Dr. Xóchitl Chávez. Dr. Chavez is the first tenure-track Chicanx assistant professor in the Department of Music at the University of California, Riverside. She earned her PhD in cultural anthropology from UC Santa Cruz, with a designated emphasis on Latin American and Latino studies. Dr. Chavez is also trained in music studies, ethnomusicology and folklore, and social documentation. As a scholar of expressive culture and performance, her research specializes in transnational migration of indigenous communities from Mexico and their transborder efforts towards maintaining cultural traditions and placemaking. The title of Dr. Chavez's talk today is, as you can see, a community without a band is a community without a soul. Indigenous placemaking and sustainability of Oaxacan brass bands in Los Angeles. She will provide remarks until around 4:50 or so, and then we'll open it up for questions. But before turning things over to Dr. Chavez, I'd like to remind you all that she'll also be facilitating a collective songwriting workshop tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. in rooms 1067 and 1068 in the Honors College. This event is free and open to the public, so please join us. Bring your voice, creativity, and your instrument. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Xóchitl Chávez. Dr. Chávez, the floor is yours.
Gracias. Un cordial saludos y afectuoso saludo a todos presentes. Thank you for the gracious invitation and all of the energies towards coordinating my visit. I'm grateful to be able to speak in this, the Binational Migration Institute Speaker Series, and agradezco toda la atención de todos que son parte del Confluence Center, the Binational Migration Institute, Daniel Martínez, pero más que nada mi estimado colega Dr. Mauricio. Es un placer estar aquí en la Universidad de Arizona. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge and thank indigenous communities in Oaxaca, Mexico, and the migrant communities located in California for allowing me to live, learn, and collaborate with them since 2005. This work would have not been possible without the participation of various community-based bands, music educators located in Los Angeles and throughout Oaxaca. I also acknowledge our presence on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the Odame, and the Yaqui nations. There is an estimated 120,000 Oaxacan indigenous migrants currently settling and working in Los Angeles, California. With 50 years of perseverance and dedication, community leaders teach fellow paisanos, countrymen and women, and youth how to read and play music in backyard patios, driveways, and in small rented spaces. The music played during open-air concert is not taught in public school systems within the United States, nor in the public school systems in Oaxaca. Rather, well-known musically inclined community members in autonomous migrant-led community spaces hence function as traditional bearers, transmitting knowledge. Interestingly, the musical transmission of Oaxacan Philharmonic bands occurs similarly in Los Angeles as in Oaxaca. That is, in a non-institutional educational conditions. Independent of its location, a trained band conductor is needed to rehearse the ensemble in these spaces, and beginners are challenged by both learning to read sheet music and the technical masterings of their instrument. To understand the cultural connection between philharmonic bands in Oaxaca and in California, I conducted ethnographic research from 2014 to 2020, before the pandemic and now resuming again, at which I registered at least 40 Zapotec Oaxacan Philharmonic bands in California. In Los Angeles County alone, 25 active Philharmonic bands still perform. Yet music does not occur in a vacuum. Social cultural elements tied to the musical tradition in California, not present in Oaxaca, includes the practitioners' precarious migration status, systematic discrimination, a double layer of linguistic challenges, and the claims-making practices, as well as their dedication to maintaining their cultural identity. As such, the persistence of indigenous Mexican Philharmonic bands in California sheds light on their resiliency. The issue in the literature is that public and academic discourse has erroneously presented a stereotype, an image of indigenous Oaxacans both in Mexico and in the United States as poorly undersourced and powerless. My ethnographic research provides a new perspective in that I propose an alternative image of survival and adaptability that can only happen through artistic creativity, grit, intention, precision, collaboration, and investment of collective practices. Some of these practices include intergenerational pedagogy and deliberate linking to social practices, such as religion, fiestas, and of course, music. I thus intervene in a broader discourse to insist that we balance our knowledge of what is power in a community and how the survival and adaptive strategies can be observed via pedagogical practices and the concepts of placemaking, which can be understood as the collective memory and visions of reimagining everyday urban space. Okay, so I know we're only a few folks here, but if you feel comfortable, I want to invite you to close your eyes or soften your gaze, if you will, and listen to this recording and think of the following concepts: place, survival, and intergenerational pedagogy. Let's open our eyes and come back. Did your ears associate this sound with place, survival, or pedagogy? What did some of you think about in terms of hearing that sound, right? As to where it takes us? Would you even think about hearing this in urban spaces? So I'm going to show you what this selection of music that you just heard, called el anuncio, the call, represents in terms of placemaking. In previous research, I discussed the transnational flow of cultural productions among indigenous Oaxacan migrants. The term for the region, Oaxaca, California, was coined by Michael Kearney and represents a cross-border public space that Zapotec and Mixtec indigenous migrants continuously traversed in search of economic and employment stability. Cultural practices reproduced in this region included festivals, dance, and music. And since the advent of the Bracero program in the 1940s and again in the 1980s, indigenous Oaxacan migrants in California have created vast infrastructures of networks across this region, along with the creation of community-based philharmonic bands and the Zapotec reproduction of cultural performances such as the Guelaguetza Festival. This festival also, the Guelaguetza Festival and these bands are part of a space that is the civic, social, and cultural engagement that Oaxacan migrants actively shape and bring together their lives in the U.S. with their communities of origin. So in this talk, I center how the Oaxacan community-based bands carry on their own forms of placemaking, a concept used to facilitate creative methods of music transmission and sustainability of Oaxacan philharmonic bands as they navigate the conflicts and challenges in cosmopolitan cities such as Los Angeles. Understanding music-making practices and locations where bands rehearse and perform often offer insights of this placemaking process of community members who collectively reimagine and continually strengthen connections between the people and the places they share with others. Due to the multiplicity of its ethnic and linguistic expressions, Oaxaca is one of the most culturally diverse states in the Mexican Republic. As part of the placemaking process, paying close attention to the geographic location and social opinion of specific communities is crucial because it reveals underlying layers of how musical expressions build resiliency despite being impacted by forms of discrimination. Indigenous people have long been seen and treated as undesirable in Mexico and in the US. and the xenophobic experiences of indigenous migrant immigrants further exacerbated by feelings of perpetual otherness or foreignness. Therefore, an analysis of Oaxacan community-based philharmonic bands and placemaking demonstrate how the invisibilized communities use transnational cultural practices as acts and processes of agency. So based on this work, I argue that Oaxacan philharmonic bands facilitate transnational placemaking through the use of space, survival, and strategies, and music pedagogies for new generations of musicians. So in this picture, you will see myself with Maestra Jessica Hernandez, but my work actually started before 2014, actually in 2005, where I focused a lot with looking at communities in the Santa Cruz area and then the Valles Centrales of Oaxaca. But specifically looked to write about my first book on the Guelaguetza, and the bands actually started now in 2014. So with definitely more than, I have 50, but I know that there's more, also informal conversations that have been had in addition to the formally recorded. They take place in Los Angeles, Mexico City, the Northern Sierra region. Most of them were all in Spanish. Some of them did have Zapotec translators. And a number of the interviews, which are really interesting to look at, and I talk about somewhere later on translanguaging, is the Spanglish or Saponiol. And one of the things that I want to make sure to talk about here is how I employ the Thomason and Lipsitz methods of accompaniment or acompañamiento, right? In both its practice, such as accompaniment as participating with and augmenting a community of travelers on the road, and secondly, how accompaniment focuses or functions as a practice of participating with others to create music. So over the years, I've been allowed to accompany Indigenous community leaders to meetings in California, as well as being part of community councils in Oaxaca. So in this transnational community-based research with the Oaxacan band, each analytical step of my acompañamiento as a Chicana activist scholar with the California-based Oaxacan migrant communities is bearing witness to how they navigate and negotiate the access to these spaces, the resources, and the recognition on both sides of the US and Mexico border. So how many of you even knew, just to kind of like break up the monotony of the talk, knew about Oaxacan philharmonic bands? Or that there was even some, a few, maybe, a couple? It depends if you're familiar, right? So the fame of the Oaxacan bands emerged actually in Mexico's nation-building story, right? So the development of the first wind bands as we know them today go back to the mid-1800s, when communities tried to imitate military bands imported during the brief reign of the Emperor Maximilian. So former Mexican presidents, I'm going to go through this really fast, Porfirio Diaz, Benito Juarez, respectively commissioned the creation of military bands in their home state of Oaxaca. And these bands later became civil organizations known as state bands of Oaxaca. And their popularity of these ensembles became really evident in the 20th century, especially after the Mexican Revolution in 1910, when local authorities everywhere formed wind bands with military musicians to play at every Sunday at your gazebo for public entertainment. The state band's instrumentation consisted of, just so when I'm talking about philharmonic, because I know I'm bringing in a lot of like music stuff, so philharmonic bands are ensembles that include flutes, clarinets, saxophones, trumpets, baritone, horn, trombone, sousaphone, percussion, cymbals, snare drums, and your bass drum, not strings. Just to make sure that we got that clear. So during the Mexican Revolution, leaders, to kind of also give this idea, when we think about how did bands come about, right? So in the South, we see this happening. In the North, actually, Pancho Villa also enlisted wind bands to accompany the soldiers as they trained and fought on the battlefield. So the rise of brass bands began in the 1920s, right, as part of this nationalist cultural education program under the supervision of the Secretaría de Educación Pública, which was created as part of the Misiones Culturales, right, with Vasconcelos. However, a lot of things that people kind of forget is many of these policies were used to educate the people under a unified national identity. So things such as fiestas, dances, and music were part of that way of re-educating and helping to rebuild a national identity. One of the things is, though, when they were doing this project, indigenous communities were present, but only as static historical figures of Mexico in the past, not part of their contemporary citizenry, right? So that's something to think about in terms of what was happening. So the state of Oaxaca has an extensive musical repertoire influenced by 20th century European salon dance genres, such as waltzes, marches, and pasodobles. While each of these genres have a distinct origin in Oaxaca, they were adapted to the Philharmonic band instrumentation such that native composers used the musical forms to create their own musical pieces, influenced by local and indigenous styles. So, not to get too nerdy, but you'll hear different rhythm patterns and compositions, so there's different ways that you can hear the notations in that. So what we see then is the repertoire also includes danzas, which are your ritual dances, sones and jarabes, chilenas, and danzones. And many of these musical genres have undergone at least 150 years of transculturation, whereby Mexican composers created their own distinct sound with a specific meaning for their community. So when we think of Oaxacan composers and musicians are recognized for their significant contributions, when we think about the compositions of danzón musics, right? Leading and forming parts of the danzoneras throughout Mexico. But what was interesting is while wearing military uniforms or snazzy suits in dance halls and kiosks, that they formed part of placemaking processes for indigenous musicians, past and present. So just so you get a bit of a sound here, we have, this one is Danzón Miredas, which was written by composer Amador Pérez Dimas. And this one is about the nymphs, and this was dedicated actually to some of you who might be familiar with Mexico City's danzón locations. I know it's 4:30 and I don't want you all to get too dreamy. So that one was written in 1932. We're going to bring it almost 100 years later, so you can hear actually a much more vibrant march, and this is a paso doble. Before I begin, I want to actually talk about the person. When we think about transculturation, what does that mean? These blendings of types of musical forms, right, that came in with one another or that are incorporated. So with this doble paso was actually composed by Oaxacan Ayuk or Mije composer Pedro Hernández Vázquez. And when we think about the word paso dobles, it's a Spanish word to mean a double step. It's a fast-paced Spanish military march that is actually used by the Spanish infantry and during bullfights that you might hear. But this genre is traditionally played as a closing number on the Sunday afternoon concerts in the town plaza, and Chamis was dedicated to the composer's youngest son, Octavio. While it's a very, as he said in an interview, while it's a very powerful piece, Maestro Pedro noted that it also exudes an air of calmness, much like what he wishes for his son, who has still many years of life ahead of him. Song. So during my research in the Sierra Norte region of Oaxaca, interlocutors ranged in ages from mid-60s to the 95 was the eldest. And they shared with me that particularly during the 1930s and 50s, community bands were highly supported through these communal donations by the residents in the village. And this was in order to purchase their new instruments. So being part of the village band was a highly respected role and also signified their participation in civic duty. And that also exempted them from other communal cargo responsibilities. And this practice still continues today. One of the things that was also very important, who I was able to interview, was Maestro Ismael Mendez. He was the first Zapotec instructor, a music instructor in an indigenous boarding school called El CIS, the Centro de Integración Social número 8 en Sagocho. So this indigenous boarding school, actually, the only kind of thing that had a trade, two trades, to either be a shoemaker or a panadero. And then from there, they actually, in the 1980s, made the school to have music, right? Because this is when there was a thrive. Music was like extremely thriving in the community base, right? But because of the devaluation of the Mexican peso in 1982, it caused mass immigration, and where waves of men from the Sierra villages left seeking economic relief, right? Thus leaving a community without a band. So it's Maestro Ismael's words, a community without a band is a community without a soul. And this expression warns fellow villagers and migrant musicians about the importance of their community-based bands and the vital role in their placemaking process. So to heed this musical concern, as I mentioned, the nearby village made the specialized program specifically in 1984. And he actually taught there, Maestro Ismael taught there for 25 years. And what you see here, what's important about this image is last year for the St. Cecilia Patron Saint Festival, these are all his students that have immigrated to Los Angeles and have started bands. So it was a very precious moment and important to get to see how the different efforts that each one of them have done. And one of the community bands and it was actually Maestro Maqueos right here. He's one of that has the Maqueos Academy, who makes this big, they rent out a big hall in Los Angeles, and they have over 8 bands. So you have 300 people in the center, and then the rest of the community members out there. So when you're going to these audiciones de banda, or when they're celebrating St. Cecilia, you're easily around 2,000, 3,000 people just at this all-day concert. So to move on and thinking about, okay, I've talked about the history, why folks have left, but how are they formed? Where are they playing, right? And I shared this, right, in thinking about Los Angeles. We're gonna kind of go to specifically Koreatown. Residential segregation by ethnicity predates the arrival of many immigrant groups to Los Angeles. In fact, immigrants in areas such as, immigrants in search of intra-ethnic well-being continue reproducing pre-existing settlement patterns through their use of social networks to find housing. So the concentration of immigrants in specific neighborhoods is further exacerbated by immigrants' need for affordable housing, which is often unavailable and is deemed less desirable to live in. So for example, the communities of Koreatown, Mid-City, where demographics were historically Black and Koreans, and now the demographics have shifted to Central Americans from Guatemalans, and then as well as specifically Oaxaca. But there is a legacy of negative attitudes and discrimination towards indigenous Oaxacans and their children is manifested as a result of colonial logics and present-day forms of racism at the hand of many mestizo immigrants in the U.S., as well as Latino heritage and non-Mexican people or politicians in Los Angeles. So indigenous immigrants is unique because not only do they cross national borders, but indigenous immigrants also cross legal, racial, ethnic, cultural, and regional borders. So to combat these various forms of discrimination and build a sense of community in the 1980s, many groups actually made binational organizations or called hometown associations based on a common shared identity. And one of the things is what they did originally was to create these organizations. They would create fundraisers and send the money back for their communities to have parks or to help with medical types of things in their own community. So when we're thinking about this placemaking process, the earliest Oaxacan bands in Los Angeles were established established in the 1970s based on two factors. As I previously mentioned, one was the fundraisers, right? Also to help mark life cycle celebrations. But the two initial bands were all male, and that was Banda Santa Maria Xóchitl and Banda Xóchitl Chávez. These first generation of brands were formed out of that need to contribute back to their community. But we see in 2001, the second generation of bands formed out of different needs, right? This was one because of what was happening in terms of when we think about different vices that were happening in the streets of Los Angeles. And so they, the Banda Nueva Dinastía de Xóchitl, as well as San Andrés Solaga, representing also additional communities. So, again, as I mentioned, these were very important to deter youth from urban violences that were happening. But one of the things that, in addition, in conversations with parents, not only and youth, is these practice spaces were cathartic and safe spaces to desahogarse, to vent, as well as a place to process their experiences as fellow community members and to try to seek out support from one another. So this work that I'm doing helps to document the spatial distribution of rehearsal locations, and it also charts migration patterns by specific indigenous communities. So this map of downtown Los Angeles illustrates the rehearsal location of Oaxacan bands, many of which are in Koreatown and mid-cities. So as I call them, these neighborhoods are microzones of several Zapotec communities and other well-known sites of Zapotec cultural productions are within these spaces, such as Normandy Park, and this park specifically holds Oaxacan basketball tournaments. It used to hold the annual Guelaguetza Festival. So I want to pause here really quick, and I want to acknowledge a very sensitive nature of data that are on the maps as I'm sharing, and because of the vulnerability of Oaxacan communities. And I invite you to join me in thinking about these particular slides, the one before and the one that I have now, as I share this information from a place of love and from a place that wants to trust that nobody will use this information to harm communities. Remembering contemporary mass shootings such as in Gilroy, El Paso, Buffalo, New York, in the South, Monterey, California, among many other tragedies that have happened recently. All of these sites where racial and ethnic minorities are concentrated. And I shared this also because it's, in terms of thinking about the communities of where mass shooting has been perpetuated, that information was known in advance. And so I just take that also just out of an ethical politics to make note of that. For their protection, I do not give out present or published street addresses or GPS coordinates on the pins. So with that in mind, I do want to continue, but I did want to make that announcement if anyone was curious. So you're probably thinking like, why is she so concerned as a cultural anthropologist and musician with maps, right? But it's because of that background of thinking about different forms of migration, what is being recreated here, right? When this previous map was a much more zoned in, and I'm looking now further out. This is a map of Los Angeles. This is a map of the Sierra Juárez in Oaxaca, or the northern Sierra, Sierra Norte. And I've been to a number of these communities, but what we see here is actually almost an exact replication of how these communities are here, are recreated as best as possible in Los Angeles. So this is pre-pandemic, right? And there has been some shifts since there, and also because of what's happening with gentrification. But the point is that what we're thinking about as a result of this concentration by Oaxacan immigrants is thinking about the shifts of what was formerly Korean communities. Now we have indigenous nonprofits, we have cultural organizations, you have Latino business coalitions, and people who are working with the Los Angeles city, right, to create what's called a Oaxacan corridor in this particular area. So of course, the naming of a space signals the demographic shifts of an area and raises questions of development of multiracial neighborhoods and the relationship among the ethnic communities. So I just want to kind of show you as well some of the places that where folks practice real quick. in just out of respect for time, we have Xóchitl Chávez, which are one of the first bands. They folks, as they were able to afford to buy a home in the 70s, they actually dug out a basement. So this is what kind of practices are done like. Now during the pandemic, people, before the cost of lumber went up, they actually did a little bit of a renovation and they continued to work the backyard into a patio. We also have maqueos where they practice in warehouses. But through the participation and efforts of families that work at different spaces, they are able to soundproof locations with egg cartons and donate other donated items to make sure, and then families all participate by giving money here to help make sure that they can ensure weekly practices. And these are really important. One of the other places, Linwood, right, which is close to Compton, they actually work with the local school. And so on the weekends, they're able to go to an elementary school cafeteria. It kind of is not the most convenient because if any of you have sat in an elementary school cafeteria table, it kind of hurts as an adult, but that's where folks are. So I just want to also show in terms of thinking about the placemaking, right? This is the annual parade that happens for the Guelaguetza Festival and has become a cultural marker for Oaxaqueños. They take up at least 2 miles down Pico Boulevard, and this ends at Normandy Park. And so the first Guelaguetza took place in 1986, and these calendas or processions have been happening now at least 7 years. So pardon my video as I was filming with one hand holding my saxophone and the other one with the video camera. So you'll kind of get a little bit of a rascuache style video, but this constitutes what I'm referring to as the Oaxacan corridor. Okay, it was short because I had to pay attention to what I was doing with the band. So to bring in actually a concept here by a dear scholar, Professor Magañas, in thinking about the multimodal archiving method, right? When we think about the populating of these streets, right? If you got to see a little bit of the glimpse of, you saw brightly painted indigenous-owned small businesses, interspersed between businesses with Asian architecture features. Some of them were formerly owned Korean businesses and that are now owned and don contemporary murals painted by Oaxacan artists. So these striking murals and colors further tell a story of community's visibility through what cultural anthropologist Maurice Magañas called the multimodal archiving method, and we can see how space is shaped and shared among its residents. Within these walls, right, is another form of collective organizing and teaching. So as we talked about how is this music happening, this is an escoleta. And what an escoleta means, it's a small school where children are being taught to read and play music during the evening and weekend classes. So previously, sheet music was obtained through international courier services when someone may travel to Oaxaca. But sheet music now is primarily, and that music was primarily handwritten notations. For the musicians in the room, reading hand-written notation is pretty interesting, especially if it's been duplicated many times. But what we're seeing now is that the new generation are retranscribing that music so that way it's electronically can be shared via WhatsApp. And there has to be a lot of permission from the composers. And so that's something that also, if they are still alive, but that's also a whole nother conversation about how this circuit of music is being electronically shared. Even educational booklets, and Maya Stories Maya's booklet is now made electronically. You have to participate in 125 music lessons with one of these schools before you are allowed to go with your next generation up and present. So when we think about also what's happening, not only from the document, but what is the language that's being spoken during this lesson? So we have a range of Zapotec, Spanish, and English. For the most part, classes are linguistically bilingual and require an astute sense of bimusicality of the instructor. So when we look here, we seek, in this research, it's to seek that how they make a contribution in the broader scholarly literature on bimusicality, and incorporating my colleague's linguistic anthropologist, Claudia Holguin, is her concept of translanguaging a stylistic practice, and this can happen in music, right? By participating in these community-based bands, it prepares youth to participate not only within their cultural festivities of an origin, but also they're speaking in 3, if not 4 languages, right? Understanding what is happening musically, also linguistically. So it's what the late social and cultural theorist Juan Flores describes as this circular pattern of cultural production. So through music, LA youth are connecting their here, migrant life, to there. Returning to Oaxaca as a musician representing their community in Los Angeles is a great accomplishment and means their claim to their pueblo's identity. I want to give one last oral example of placemaking in California, and I'd like to turn to this march that's called La Sierra Juárez in Riverside. And this was done by composer Oligario Robles, and it was actually at the inaugural edition of Oaxacan Bands hosted at UCR in 2008. And this song was inspired, for Robles Marcha was inspired because no university in the United States or in Mexico had ever offered a space or an opportunity for Oaxacan indigenous bands to come together and play their traditional music in an academic setting and having a community focus. So according to indigenous traditions, at a band audition, all competing bands come together for one song, this march. And I'll play just a snippet for you so you can hear. This is a live recording. Of the tuba, because the recording device was closest to there. But this composition united 4 Los Angeles-based Oaxacan bands in an outdoor stage in front of UCR's, the University of California, Riverside's Performing Arts Building. The bands I had invited were the first 2 all-male bands and the first 2 youth bands formed in Los Angeles. So it was really beautiful to see that many of the founding members of the bands that were now in their late 60s and 70s returned to join 4 generations of musicians who played together as one large Zapotec community. 140 indigenous Oaxacan musicians sonically and physically marked their place at the University of California. So the adage, Maestro Ismael Mendez shared with me when I first began this work, a community without a band is a community without a soul, became a stark reality as a result of a global pandemic of COVID-19. We all experienced challenges to the shelter-in-place regulations for nearly 2 years. For the Oaxacan community, music rehearsal locations signified more than just a place to play music. The locations are community centers. They are spaces that provide reaffirming cultural activities and a safe after-school setting for children who are waiting for their parents to come home from work. Unfortunately, due to the loss of jobs, families were no longer able to afford music lessons. So what did the community do, right? In terms of thinking about these factors significantly impacted music instructors in regards to the income and their ability to pay rent for the spaces. As educators, we all know too well the technology and internet issues and how that was further exacerbated by Zoom's inability to play multiple media feeds as simultaneously. So with all of the limitations in terms of income, internet, loss of interest, right, it was a very big blow. Some bands folded under the pressure. Some communities lost a piece of their soul. The music and community-based bands are vital elements, again, to mark life cycles. And sadly, the Oaxacan community was hit rather hard by the coronavirus, and the death toll was exceptionally high. Customarily, the departed person received an all-night vigil and funeral ceremony, serenaded by their local band. Tragically, funeral rites and repatriation of a body back to Oaxaca became impossible due to the geopolitical policies and rhetoric of former President Trump and Mexican President López Obrador's administration. This legal violence reminded indigenous migrants communities of their liminal status and their non-belonging in both countries. So in response to these limitations, music educator and director Yulisa reminded us and me of the adaptability of the Oaxacan community in these challenging situations, where she shared that this was actually a wake-up call for many of the younger people as well, right? And so they had to use their creativity as a space to think about how could they do timing of rehearsals differently, how could they create, and ensure safe spaces if it was outdoor practices. So there was a lot of things for them to take into consideration. Even the Music Academy of Maqueos began to hold virtual funeral tributes because of the limited, you can't have musicians blowing air, right? Air particles out at a funeral. So they actually did virtual funerals where they would be at Maestro Maqueos's, the school, and then they would transmit that way so it could be played on a laptop for a family to ensure. Many of the youth actually started other ventures. They started gigging. They started creating bands in their neighborhoods, and they started playing jazz, reggae, big band, even other mainstream music such as Sinaloense and Tamborazo, right? Because they needed to figure out different ways. But what that has done is actually it helped a lot of the youth to get into the music industry in different capacities. So despite the challenges to survive and belong, many bands encourage their youth to continue their education to the best of their ability. And as a result, many second-generation youth are now obtaining undergraduate and advanced degrees. I'm actually in the process of writing 3 letters of recommendations for Oaxacan musicians to go to UCLA or USC, so which has been amazing to see that happening for master's and DMA programs. So they finished their undergrad, but now moving on to other places. One of the things is many of the directors have taken their opportunity to prepare new generations of band, and we see now, as Maestra Yulisa stated, the adaptability of the Oaxacan community, and they have had to do that several times by living in Los Angeles. So, in closing, I hope what I shared here with you also provokes your thinking about the broader themes in terms of that I presented earlier: placemaking, accompaniment, transnational transmission, intergenerational pedagogy, bimusicality, and translanguaging. So in researching transcultural practices of music making, it's important to recognize how tradition bearers in Oaxaca transmit musical knowledge in the community context in non-institutional and informal spaces, and how these practices continue to hold in Los Angeles. There is also the opportunity to connect with formal institutions such as UCR, where we were able to adapt a ritual for a specific community need at a campus. One of the other things is the cultural production exemplifies the translocal networks and relationships required in their sustainability. While first-generation Oaxacan bands in Los Angeles formed out of a base of a need to their hometown infrastructure projects, second-generation bands are established as a way to prevent youth from participating in urban vices and transgressions. When within neighborhoods such as Koreatown and Mid-City, Oaxacan families have carved out spaces while coexisting alongside Korean, Black, and Central American communities. In addition to considering placemaking as an intangible process of involving social cultural transmission, the tangible aspect of meaning is constructed via the geopolitical settlement location and rehearsal spaces. The phenomenon of adaptation also extends into new forms of musical expressions and transmission. And in Los Angeles, the proximity with their fellow ethnic neighborhoods and venues adds to the influence and incorporation of musical styles, right, and thinking of other creative collaborations, while still reflecting on their Oaxacan heritage and transnational identities. So as a result of the pandemic, younger generations helped older community members engage with the difficulties of technology, and also the issues of social distance, and helping them to pass through what it means when losing a loved one due to COVID-19. So the adaptations involved with the musical transmission led the Oaxacan community members to share their music via different social media platforms. And when we think about the expression, a community without a band is a community without a soul, demonstrates the continuous need for collective community efforts in fostering cultural practices of Oaxacan community traditions, despite the forms of exclusion and discriminatory attitudes against Oaxacan communities. So when we think about that, I just want to share some of my other broader research agenda. By the April or May, my first book will be coming out, La Guelaguetza, the Oaxacan Migrant Festivals in the Making of Transborder Indigeneity with the Oxford University Press. And thinking about all of this, what I presented today is going to be part of the second book. And I actually do continue a collaboration with an all-female Oaxacan band in Oaxaca called Mujeres del Viento Florido. April of 2024, I invite you to join us at UCR, where I will be having an Encuentros de Oaxaca to bring, again, to kind of replicate the 2018, but this is where the community members will actually get to present their work that they've been doing as now scholars and also as composers. So if you're around the Los Angeles area, but one thing that's really important that has really pushed me is expanding beyond this regional concept of Oaxaca, California to address new migration patterns and processes of claiming indigeneity in greater Oaxaca, because I have now started to work with bands in North Carolina, in the state of Washington, and New Jersey. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions or suggestions, and I just want to give a thank you and recognize also ancestors here in this community and other colleagues that have been very important in my life and in this work. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Chavez. I'd like to go ahead and open it up. Any questions from the audience? Questions?
I got a lot of questions.
Well, let's turn it over to the maestro.
This is like dissertation exam. Here we go.
Awesome, thank you.
Dr. Magana in the flesh.
Thank you,
Y'all are gonna
Xóchitl.
see if I'm worthy of my PhD right now.
No, that was really great. That was really great. It's been a while since I've heard you talk about your research, and it's really exciting to see where you've gone with it and where you're going with it. It was also very. It was really great to see how you're incorporating sort of these different dimensions of place, right? You're talking about the relationship between bandas and placemaking, right? But you're incorporating the audio, the maps, the history, right, of migration, and then how through migration these communities are sort of reconstructed in Los Angeles. And so the connection between these networks, right, these migrant networks, these cultural networks, and histories of migration came through really, really clear. But I'm curious, especially thinking about that video clip that you showed, right, where you're with one hand, you're a musician with your saxophone, and then with your other hand, you're an ethnographer documenting, right? So as a musician and as an ethnographer, how do you think about the role of the sonic in producing space and place? Right, so thinking about music, but that characteristic, right, of music that is so different from the article of mine that you cited, right, with the multimodal archives, right? I'm thinking about the visual, right? So you're talking about the embodied and the sonic, in addition to, right, these physical places where the music happens. So how do you think about that?
If I were to close my eyes and I were walking, particularly through a specific neighborhood, there's, on one street, there are two different community bands. And so as you're walking through, right, as the ethnographer trying to find where band rehearsal is, you just have to listen. right? And as a musician, now almost a decade with the communities, you could tell which community it is because their sound is a way of identifying that community. Just like how embroidery for different textile can mark your indigenous identity, that's the same way of the sound of the music. So when we think also about the audición that happened just 2 Sundays ago for St. Cecilia, I was outside and people can already tell which band it is just by the sound. And so it's been interesting, right? Because, and that's been one of the dual parts of, and I actually was very fortunate to be able to play in Santa Maria de Xóchitl Chávez with the all-women band now this past August. I don't take notes. I don't record because my hands and my mouth are involved in the work, right? And I'm having to breathe. So this is where we become, it's not to say that you can't do both, but and as you're just saying this, the sheet music also then becomes a type of placemaking, but also evidence. It's also part of the tangible to talk about, depending on the title or even what were the inspirations for the music, right? I know I might have answered it in a roundabout way, but it has become quite interesting to think about, for community members who are in the know, you can start to identify communities just by the sound, or even by walking through a particular street. You might be hearing the sound kind of flowing out from a restaurant, right? In Koreatown, or if I start thinking about Linwood, as you start walking, Linwood, actually, so the elementary school's in Compton. And so that's also very stark different, because when you're on the street, sometimes you might be hearing tamborazo, and then down the way, coming get to the school, you have Philharmonic community music, and then you'll have like rap playing. So in the Compton neighborhoods and Linwood, that it's sonically different as well. But thank you for that question. It's really important to think about as ethnographers, as how do we write about these experiences? But I think for me, I'll say this, I no longer write down notes very much, because for me, it's about how do I sound when I'm playing now? Like my way of what I've learned and how they're identifying with me too, or they identify me, is how do I sound? So my way of speaking is no longer through written word, it's through how I play. How does my saxophone sing?
Thank you very much. I find fascinating your dedication to bring the community with institution, especially the University of California. And I'm curious about obviously the challenges that you might have faced doing this, because I think many communities miss the opportunity to really bring the youth into the institutions, because they're already playing mariachis or band, and where we are, and I'm gonna look around before I say something, but I think we are missing an opportunity, and I've been saying this for a while, that we are the capital of the mariachi here in the Southwest, and the way that you're describing this project seems like a perfect model to really capitalize on the talent in the ganas and the desire of the community to go beyond the music, right? So can you talk about some of your experience in terms of bringing that together? Because I think it's first of all, gracias y felicitaciones, but tell us more about how you've done that.
Thank you. So to create this, and this is just from a musician's perspective, to get all of this to happen, as you can see, hay gente de corbata. What I made sure, I always ask permiso and I consult with community elders. I made sure my first step is always to communicate and say, hey, I want to do this event. Me pueden asesorar, right? Because it's not me going and say, oh, I saw this, let me do it on my own. Siempre es con permiso and being mentored. And so there was a lot of, not only just phone calls, but WhatsApp, to ask permiso first to the community, would you be willing to collaborate with me, and then to tell me what are the cultural nuances of having, and how to do the audición, right? Because there's even a cadence of how you announce the songs and the information. So one of the things was, we made it trilingual, so it was Zapotec, Spanish, and English. I incorporated making sure to talk to all of the composers to ask for permiso for the music that was going to be played collectively. We had the music that was written, it was composed by someone. The rest of the music that was used for the quote-unquote competition, people don't talk about that because these audiciones are where you bring your best repertoire, right? And that stays hidden for 3 months in advance. People aren't allowed to bring their cell phones. And when we did come together to have the formal ensayo at Maestro Maqueo's, everyone had to leave their cell phones. Everyone had to leave the cell phones, no recordings. The only thing that was allowed to bring in was instruments and all of the pizzas and soda and water that I brought in. Because it's that high of competition, right? And that's how the communities run it. With the university, thankfully at that time we had actually a Dominicana, a Latina dean. And so she helped with that a lot. I will say this area where like the piso and that, it was really poorly maintained. And because I also work with a lot of the local indigenous communities, I have an article actually written about this event. It's called the Sierra Juarez in Riverside, so talking about when to not only bring the institution, but also how to collaborate with the native communities, the Kawia, because we also had a blessing, right? And since, in addition to the blessing, but also conversation about other indigenous communities coming on to Kawia territory. So that was, some folks tried to say, well, why did you even do that? But would they have ever even been into conversation? And I was like, but this is important to talk about representations of the different indigenous communities on this land that are traversing it. But one of the other reasons why I got support was because that area of the performing arts was so under-maintained, and we had a meeting with the chancellor. This was actually broadcasted on Univision. So I publicly guilted them in saying that this was going to be transmitted through all of the different collaborating syndicated channels, and it actually got down to Peru. And so once they heard that, $90,000 went into just maintenance alone. But it was a lot of cultural educating, especially with Western musical production folks, because they wanted to, there was no place on our campus to hold 140 musicians, so we had to have it outside. But I did get comments of like, ¿Quién te crees? Who are you? Who do you know? Why are they investing so much money? Why are you asking for risers for the instruments and this and that? And I'm like, thankfully also had other individuals that are not US born. They were from other communities. So I was really thankful to have these other advocates to say, she's bringing in, this is when we talk about wanting diversity and ethnic music, you have to have your supporters also within administrators. But I did break my my initial complimentary research funds to make it happen. So I guess if we want to call it, and I know this is being transmitted, public guilting to administrators. Public guilting to administrators, not in a bad way, but just to let them know, hey, this is like, this is going to happen and our place isn't looking too good, so we need to yeah, but also because this was the first time, and Jessica was one of the very first Oaxaqueñas to actually graduate from UCR in 2010. So she actually helped, there was a history, some people knew her, but there are lots of Oaxaqueños that come from Los Angeles. So UCR knew there were Oaxaqueños, but they had never understood who they were or what their musical contributions were. And I did have colleagues saying, oh, I didn't know they knew how to play these Western instruments. I thought it was just like, the tambor y carizo. And so it was a very enlightening moment for a lot of our composers and musicologists that only work in Western countries. I'm trying to think how to answer. But I think if anything, I heard from colleagues, another dean from education, Luis Rodriguez, he said it was very transformative. Byron Adams, the faculty who sponsored Jessica, he said it was the first time that someone has actually ever used that public space for what it was made for, to have, because of the acoustics, it's a natural acoustics, that I finally used it, and now it's being maintained, it gets used by the dance department, so I have definitely created a reputation of, when I organize events, I always have a lot of people that show up, and they might not be traditional UCR students, so that's also coded for other things. But I still make sure to always collaborate, that these are community-oriented and public-facing events, so that they don't have to pay for parking. I make sure everyone is fed by bringing in taqueros. So yes, I throw big fiestas where I have to get, as in Oaxaca, you would get like padrinos, right? So there's a lot of padrinos and madrinas that I ask for money.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Wanda.
3 seconds when it turns green, you're good to go.
Xóchitl.
Yes.
Oh my God, this was wonderful. I'm so excited for your book as well.
Thank
So
you.
great, new reading in 2024. Two of the things that you were talking about. Maybe just one question, but maybe because you yourself are translanguaging, and we've heard so many languages here. I'm so interested in the way that you brought together the idea of bimusicality and translanguaging, and I'm glad it's on that page as well, because together those things make me think of this idea of auditory grammars that are resistant, right? It's kind of part of what I do with literature, but that is also informed by music, right? And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about maybe some of the way that this shows up in the actual compositions, whether in the titles or in the kind of the directions for how to play something. I'm wondering if you noticed something of that blending of the translanguaging and bimusicality in the scores or the compositions themselves.
Thank you for making me think of that, because that's like 3 layers, right? Like that's like an onion. Like you're making me think, like, how do I peel this onion, right? Written music right here, if I can get it bigger. Sometimes, this one is written very nice and it's on computer, right? Because normally otherwise it would have been written by hand. So all of this is very formal. Some of the older pieces aren't even in notation, they're with X's, right? So you have that in terms of like checking. I think it's with the newer, the way that, and actually the people who are doing the translating, this is something that for me to think about, is this current generation, like the person I'm writing the letter of recommendation for, one of the things that he's specializing is helping to transpose some of these older pieces so that the newer generations can play them. And because some of the, and this is also, okay, we'll get it. In English, we call them scores for complete, right, piece. With Oaxaqueño music, you only have partituras. You don't have a conductor piece, like the lead sheet music for the, so that's one form already. So what these youth are doing is creating the lead sheet music, right, the score for a conductor. And it's also kind of controversial, because what you're seeing now is this is now creating a westernized way to make this music readable for Western ensembles. And so that can get kind of funky, but what people are wanting to show, and a lot of the youth, what they're writing about, is saying that my music is important, and this is how it can also be read and applicable. It doesn't only have to be, in this formulation. Even the seating, now that I'm thinking about all this, so I'm glad that I'm here talking about it. The seating in Oaxacan Philharmonic Band is different from a US or Western. The instrumentation, the way the instruments are placed is different. So, so that's another form. So from the sheet music being written to the way that they're seated, because we had this at the University of Houston, we went and did a workshop. I took 3 instructors with me, and we worked with University of Houston, UT El Paso, and Dartmouth, and the youth, their students couldn't keep up with the pace, so there's another one. So the pacing of the music, They didn't understand why the seating was different. They couldn't read the music. They were having a hard time because all of them were Western trained musicians. I think in the title, actually, so there is, I want to go into my Spotify. There's a group called the Big Band, and now you hear reggae and ska with Oaxaca style music. So maybe I'll play it as we walk out. But you're starting to see bands. These are all Oaxaqueño trained in like musicians, but they're incorporating, and their titles are, you know, are very interesting. They're playful, right? So I think there's even a song that I saw on Spotify somewhere called Oaxaca, California. I just don't know. I have to see if the musicians, who they are, but we're starting to see that. The newer composition, there's a young man named Johnny Miguel who I've been encouraging to get a DMA. He is probably one of the most amazing arrangements at this last 2 Sundays ago. It's called Sones de Mexico, where he made a compilation of all the different sones that identify Mexico and then ended it with ones of Oaxaca, right? So we're seeing that kind of translanguaging happening in terms of arrangements too. I hope that, but you got me thinking, and I'm gonna make sure to write that down.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, this helps for this article. Anyone else?
Other questions?
So that last question got me in thinking something that I was thinking about before, but now in even another layer to it. But thinking about now that a lot of the musical directors in LA are now like what, second, third generation?
Yeah.
So they were trained in LA, right?
Mm-hmm.
So are you seeing generational either innovations or sort of changes in how the bands in LA are being trained and how they play versus their counterparts in Oaxaca?
Oh yes. Sorry, I was trying to get to Spotify. I don't have internet. So this is a big, like when we talk about sore spot, and when I talked about like people can tell how your instrument sings. When the US born youth go to play in the communities, what was it starting to come up? They can say that the way they play, están hablando el gringo, right? That their instrument still sounds gringo. And this is what something that the person that I'm writing the letter for, he said that in Oaxaca he sounds too Western, and in his classes in the US here he sounds too mariachi-like. So that's what his essay's about, is your exact question. And he's trained in terms of Cal Arts, the Harmony Project, he's been part of symphonies. But this is the conversation that, and you can see how it, like they're sore about it in terms of, but they want to talk about it. But what's interesting is the first Oaxaqueña now getting her DMA is in Cincinnati. And so they're coming to the US to get their DMA, so it'd be interesting. And she is one of the young women that I interviewed and I follow in terms of like to see what her experience has been like. So, and there is actually a bit, and I talk about this, where there's been economic migration. Some of the work that I'm also doing is the musical and educational migration. It's been more educational based because they learn from the community. Those in Oaxaca learn in the community, then they go to Mexico City to learn at the FAM. If they can't afford to go to the FAM, which is a Facultad de Música, they play with the Navy. So they're playing with the Marines. And so that's the way that they afford to live in the city and continue playing. And that's mainly men. So women, you don't see very much in the Marines. So there's a different route for young women in terms of this musical and educational migration. Here within the US, I have to say that's the one thing that I've really been working on and trying to give my granito de arena is to help, like if it's with the grad school applications. But what we're seeing now with some of the bands is you have some of these really well-educated community musicians in Durham, North Carolina, out in New Jersey, out in Seattle, I had heard there was one in Phoenix. They saw me working on a presentation, and the person on the other side, he's like, those are bands from Oaxaca, like, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, I'm in Phoenix. He goes, I'm part of a community band in Phoenix, so I have their phone number that I gotta follow up on. But it is interesting to kind of see the conversation between the two sides, right? Especially there is also this thing of like, for some of the musicians now, because I have also written letters for them, they're going out to France, to the conservatories out there to get these like diplomados. So that's another conversation, because a comment that has come up is, well, que ya se fueron a Francia, but they need to come back to our community and do workshops in order to continue to maintain the community identity, right? So what they learn in these westernized spaces, they're now bringing it back to the community, like directing, like conducting, because within the Oaxacan bands, there's not a conductor in front. It's actually always a trumpet player or a clarinet, and you need to learn. That was something I had to learn to do, to go back to Wanda, is you don't have the conductor in front of you. You have to learn to like watch when the trumpet or the clarinetist, from wherever you're at, there's certain ways of reading.
Thank you so much. Join me in thanking Dr. Chávez. Before I'll turn it over to Javier to close things out, but I would encourage students, if you're here, please take a moment to come up, introduce yourself to Dr. Chávez, say hi, check in. But thank you all so much for being here. And reminder, tomorrow, 3:30, workshop, Honors College, rooms 1067, 1068, 3:30, open to the public. Please help spread the word. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm gonna get this thing here. Why is it not? The internet doesn't like me.
So we're gonna have the party in Spotify, right?
Yes, I'm getting it right now.
But thanks again, and bring young people tomorrow to the workshop. It's a great opportunity. There's plenty of space, and the instrument, if you can bring the instrument, fine, but if not, it's okay. Just show up. It's gonna be fun and a great opportunity to do this. I know some people here bring their kids, at least one person, so it's intergenerational, as Dr. Chávez said. So do that. And again, my thanks to BMI and to the presenters. Someday we'll see mariachi and rap. That's my personal dream. I hope to see you soon. Gracias.